We looked around for something different for this spot, and I think we found something right here. I think you'll agree when you see her. I want you to meet a very talented lady, Miss Joan Rhodes, right here.
From the most miserable childhood imaginable, her strength, determination, and talent for entertaining made her thrive. This is the story of how a homeless girl became the world's most glamorous strongwoman. Josie Triona, better known by her stage name Joan Rhodes, was born in London, England in 1921. Her parents were very poor and had an extremely dysfunctional relationship. Her father suffered from shell shock as a result of witnessing the horrors of the First World War, and her mother often had to deal with him disappearing for extended periods of time. When Joan was 3 years old, her mother had enough and decided that this time she was going to be the one to walk out, leaving her 4 children with her husband. But what happened next was absolutely tragic. Joan's father also walked out of the house, locked the door behind him, and fled, leaving Joan and her 3 siblings, the oldest of which was just 4 years old, abandoned in the tiny rental apartment. They were alone for a couple days until the police finally showed up and broke down the door to rescue them. The children were split up, and Joan spent a couple years bouncing around between some family members and a poorhouse. This horrible betrayal by her parents would haunt Joan for the rest of her life. In fact, she would later go on to say that this deep-rooted anger she felt was what gave her extraordinary strength. On her 14th birthday, her miserable living arrangements compelled her to run away. For a while, she was homeless on the streets of London, which is where she met a strongman who agreed to pay her a small sum to help him with his act. The strongman inspired young Joan to start building up her strength. With some practice, she managed to put together her own little routine, involving bending nails, tearing phone books, and ripping decks of cards. Eventually, she started performing this routine outside an underground station in London. A very little known fact about Joan is that she got married when she was 19 years old, to a young man named Arthur Rhodes. They married in November 1939, right at the start of World War II. Just a couple weeks after their wedding, Arthur was drafted, and she never saw him again. For whatever reason, Joan decided to keep this part of her life a secret. In fact, it was only discovered after her death. But she did keep his last name, Rhodes, which everyone thought was a made-up stage name, but turns out was actually her legal last name. In 1943, Joan made her debut in the world of cinema. She was cast as an extra in a film called The Man in Grey. And yes, I did download and carefully watch through this 80-year-old movie to find this scene where Joan is on screen for a couple seconds, in the background, out of focus, bending a metal bar. While the role itself was pretty much insignificant, it allowed her to start making some connections and find more opportunities in show business. Her career really started taking off later in the 1940s. Her statuesque physique landed her several art modeling jobs, and she also worked briefly as a fashion model. Her big break came during a 6-month tour of Spain and Portugal in 1948, where she was hired as a showgirl. By this point, she began making decent money and could finally leave behind her street performances which she relied on for so long. When she returned from the continent, her next move was to audition for a freak show. This form of entertainment is understandably frowned upon today, but back then, exhibiting people with disabilities or physical abnormalities was extremely popular. Joan described the waiting room for this audition as being, quote, crowded out with midgets, a couple of very tall men, a man with no arms, and a couple of very ugly people. I sat there until my name was called and then went into the inner office where a chubby man was sitting at a desk with a girl beside him taking notes. The man immediately pointed out that Joan didn't look particularly freakish to him, to which Joan responded by picking him up and carrying him around the office. She was offered a contract on the spot for a show which was to be called Would You Believe It? Joan presented herself as the Mighty Mannequin. We can see her depicted on posters from the time wearing a leopard print dress and lifting weights. While her previous gigs mainly involved modeling and dancing, this is where Joan would start to truly make a good living and gain recognition as a strong woman. In a sense, this took her back to her roots, as she performed some of the same strength feats she learned on the streets of London as a teenager, but now adapted for the big stage where no doubt her years of experience in show business came in handy. As her contract with the freak show was coming to an end, Joan met Solly Black, who was one of the most successful talent agents at the time. Solly approached Joan in a billiards club. Curious to figure out her tricks, he asked, quote, "You're hardly half my size. How can you lift giants and tear phone books and stuff like that? If it's a conjuring trick, it's a very clever one, but you can't expect us to book an act without explaining how it's done." Joan replied, "You think it's fake?" Solly laughed and said, "Come on, we know it's fake." So Joan lifted Solly up with her arms stretched out over her head and paraded him around the billiards tables. This was quite a fancy club, so everyone fell silent as they watched in total disbelief. Then a roaring laughter erupted, and Joan was offered a contract from the best in the business. With the help of Solly, Joan turned into an international superstar during the 1950s. Her career was very long and eventful. I'll cover some more of the highlights here, but if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend you check out a book called An Iron Girl in a Velvet Glove, written by Triona Holden. It's an excellent biography and was a great source for this video. As a testament to her international fame, when her house was burgled in 1950, it was reported as far away as Australia, where the Sun newspaper printed this little piece joking about the tremendous risk the burglar took, insinuating that Joan would have beat him up if she was home at the time he broke in. When the clip made its way back to Joan, she took offense to the large, masculine, and brutish cartoon drawing of her in the magazine. So she wrote a letter to the editor and sent him a real picture of her physique. A couple months later, The Sun published this funny follow-up article apologizing to Joan and showing her actual slim hourglass figure. It says, quote, "The Sun apologizes for picking up the idea that beefiness goes with mightiness. Sorry, Joan." I think this really highlights what made Joan so special. She wasn't the only strong woman around, but there was something particularly enchanting about the contrast between her extraordinary strength and her traditionally feminine figure. Some of the other strong women I've covered on this channel would proudly flex their muscles and even include posing routines in their performances, which of course I think is awesome, but equally we can admire Joan's different approach. She was very rarely seen showing off her muscles.
I, believe it or not, am a strong woman. Yes.
She always presented a glamorous and ladylike appearance, which I suppose is exactly what made her a quote-unquote freak. Simply no one expected this beautiful woman that looked like a model to be stronger than the vast majority of men, hence the name Mighty Mannequin. Joan toured the world during the 1950s, and she also began appearing in more movies, now with longer screen time and even making it onto the cover. During Christmas of 1955, she was performing for the US Air Force in Keflavik, Iceland. The show was hosted by Bob Hope, one of the most famous comedians of the time. They were on their third show back-to-back when at the very end, Joan lifted Bob Hope to carry him off stage as she had done twice already that day. However, this time one of her heels broke, and she dropped Bob right on his head. The incident got loads of press coverage worldwide, though luckily neither of them were seriously injured. The climax of Joan's Strongwoman career came in 1958, when she was invited to entertain none other than Queen Elizabeth and the rest of the royal family at Windsor Castle. Let us remember for a second that Joan started performing while she was a homeless kid on the streets of London, just hoping that some stranger would be amused enough to toss a penny at her. Now, in her 30s, she finds herself performing in perhaps the most exclusive setting imaginable, as she charmed the royals at their grand Christmas ball. Talk about rags to riches. After the show, the Queen and others personally thanked Joan for her outstanding performance. The Queen Mother even whispered to her how wonderfully graceful she found her to be, something which really stuck with Joan. She later recalled, quote, "I enjoyed the compliment from the Queen Mother. It had always been my thing to be graceful on stage, as everyone expected me to be big and ugly." By this point, Joan Rhodes was a household name. Her Strongwoman career continued well into the 1960s, though she began to focus much more on acting during the 70s and 80s, as the kind of shows she performed in were losing their popularity. She had roles in movies such as The Pink Panther and The Elephant Man. She made her final performance in 1998 when she was in her late 70s. Joan Rhodes died in 2010 at age 89. If you made it this far, please make sure to drop a like and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll also link a playlist below with all my other videos covering old school strong women. Thank you for watching.
If you're tired out and the day seems too long, it's your own fault, so remember this song. 'Tain't what you do, it's the way that you do it.